the law review and received his Juris Doctor degree cum laude. While practicing law, he researched and authored many shroud papers, which he presented to international shroud symposia. He has appeared on numerous shroud-related broadcasts, and in 2021, he published The Hidden History of the Shroud of Turin, a book detailing the history of the shroud from the time when it covered Jesus' body in the tomb to its acquisition by the House of Savoy in the middle of the 15th century. Let's welcome Jack Markwardt again.
Welcome to my presentation of a historical text establishes the 10th century existence of the Shroud of Turin. I'm just wondering, I'm going to get to what this text is. It's called the Latin Sermon. Has anybody here heard about this Latin Sermon? Okay, a few. All right. Now, as I said this morning, some of what I will present will be opinion. You can agree or not agree, but I'll give you what the basis of my opinion is. Now, if you remember, if you were here this morning, I stated my opinion that the shroud, the study of the shroud, has largely turned into Synodon authenticology. In other words, the people who are publishing and debating, their real interest is in whether the shroud is or is not authentic. And I showed these are some of the authenticists: Vignon, Barbet, Wilson, and these are some of the medievalists: Chevalier, Thurston, and Macron. But it's my own view that take the authenticity issue out of the shroud studies, and you're going to lose the interest of most of the population who's interested in that issue, and you're also going to lose the interest of many of the researchers because that's what they're centered around. Can everybody hear me all right? I might be able to do it without. Okay. Now, the battlefields that this authenticity issue has been fought on are mainly science, which has many aspects of science, and history. And we'll do this without the slides. I've noticed that, and I mentioned this morning, that in the last 37 years, since 1988, there's been this contentious debate over the date of the shroud's manufacture, starting with the carbon dating test of 1988. But that there are reasons to reject that, or at least not to accept that finding. And I always cite the fact that they themselves admit, the testers, that there's what they call a chronological gradient that goes from the outside of the cloth to the inside, and the more it goes to the inside, the younger the dating becomes. And I think they've been left off the hook here. I think a lot of people that are in the science side are not focusing on that enough. I think that, when people do radiocarbon dating, usually a client comes in and brings it to a testing laboratory, and they test one sample. And if they ever came in with one sample and said, we've got this gradient across one sample, people would laugh at them. But what they did here is they split the sample into three, and you've got these three laboratories that are sometimes like 100 years apart, and it goes from outside to inside younger. Okay, thank you. I'll try that again. Okay, moving along. That's science. They're the bad guys. Okay, I think I'm caught up here. And they never really come out with an explanation of this. Way back, Hugh Farry, a medievalist, speculated that maybe there was contamination of some kind and maybe it was on the back of the shroud. But it was just an idea. He never proposed it. and then nobody comes back to it, and everybody's trying to make the excuses for them. I mean, God bless everybody that's there. They're trying to say there's additional materials in there, there's additional carbon from the resurrection. But this is their proof, and my background is as a lawyer, and to me the burden of proof is on the party that's asserting the fact, and they're asserting that the radiocarbon testing is accurate, and yet they've got that problem, they've got this other problem where you're supposed to have at least a 95 percentile assurance on some aspects of the results, and they never made that, and to get close they had to round up on the numbers that they had. But that's one big issue, and it's out there, and it's not resolved. And the second one is the issue of the blood stains. And the image. And this gets you into the fact that back in 1900, when Chevalier published his study, he published the Darcy Memorandum, and there's an allegation in there made by him 34 years after the fact that some unnamed artist supposedly confessed having painted the shroud's image. And that kind of carried the day for the medievalists for a long time. Before the carbon dating, this was their central proof. But one of the findings of the Stirp scientists, when they came back and did their examinations, they brought their work back to Heller and Adler to examine, is that they were confident that whatever they're looking at the image, they're not seeing brush strokes on there. It's not, the image did not get there by an artist painting the shroud. And then a couple years later, this guy comes along, Walter Macrone, and he's looking at some of the sticky tapes that Stirp created, applied to the shroud. And he's claiming that, not just that it's produced artistically, but that an artist used a brush in order to make the image. And this is rather strange today because even medievalists like Hugh Farey are not really trying to support that claim. If it's created artistically, they're trying other methods, but it doesn't fit what you would see if an artist was painting it. So that's the second scientific issue. And the third one, which I think is the overriding one for me, and I think for most people, and that is the fact that nobody's been able to come close to duplicating the image if they limit themselves to what was known and available in the 13th or 14th century, which is where they come from. You get these various renderings, and some match the shroud in certain ways, but it doesn't match all the qualities of the shroud in other ways. So that's a long way to get this point. And the point is that it's my opinion, it's been my opinion, that right now the scientific debate over authenticity is somewhat of a stalemate. We're not seeing anything new that's being produced for quite a while now that would kind of move that debate one way or the other. So I like to believe this because it then confirms my decision to have gotten involved in history, because this is where I think the answer really lies. Because when history, you're dealing with things that do exist, they're not very theoretical. You're dealing with texts, and you're dealing with artistic productions, icons, and the like. And that is why, one of the reasons why when I finally got involved in sinology, I said I'm going to pursue history, not only because it is my interest, but I think we can really find an answer here if we look hard enough. So when I say I've studied history, I study ancient medieval history, I study church history, history of the Middle East, Byzantium, France, and I've done my share of research on Byzantine art and numismatics as well. And the more I learned, and this morning I mentioned it took me a period of about 5 years, from about 1986 to 1981, the more that I learned, the more convinced I became that the shroud was Jesus' authentic burial cloth. And then in the next 20 years, the more I went back to some of these texts that were very obscure, and some of them were written in Latin and some in Greek. But I came to the conclusion that there is what I would call a documented history of the shroud that goes back to the 1st century. And so in 2021, after I had been at this for some 35 years, I published a book. It's called The Hidden History of the Shroud of Turin. And it really starts at the beginning, starts at where Jesus kept things secret, told his disciples not to throw their pearls before the swine. It shows where Jesus preached in parables because he knew people were after him. They were going to try to execute him if they could, because he was trying to replace the religious order at that time, which was really run by the Sadducees in Jerusalem with all the temple offerings and that sort of thing, and by the Pharisees, who were the interpreters of the law. And Jesus was going around preaching that he was interpreting the law. He's going to interpret the law in a new way. He's not going to change a jot or tittle of the law, but he's got a certain interpretation. And then I carry it through right from the 1st century until the 15th century. And I cite a whole lot of different textual references and give the support for why I think they're references to the shroud. And so I want to just mention a couple of these so that the Latin sermon kind of makes sense to you. It's not like I went to the 10th century and said, hey, I've got a great text and this is going to prove the shroud's existence. This was just one in a line of things. And the first reference was in Galatians 3:1, in which St. Paul, thank you. Go ahead and catch us up here. Okay, that's my book. That's the Latin sermon. Okay, I think that's where we're at. We're going to the Abgar legend next. St. Paul says to the Galatians, why are you acting like a bunch of fools when you actually saw before your very eyes the portrayal of Jesus Christ crucified? And so I can't go into each one of these issues because every one is debatable. I'd be happy to do that if anybody ever wants to debate it, but what I want to show is a progression. So that's 1st century, that's about 56. And then in the 2nd century, around 192, there's a famous inscription, one of the most famous Christian inscriptions in the world ever. It's called the inscription of Abercius. And Abercius is going out to the, traveling through Syria, which is kind of where Edessa was at that time. It's in Mesopotamia, but Syria was enlarging its borders at that time. And he talks about there being that he's accompanied by a fish of great size and perfect with his blood mingled with his body. And again, if you looked at this kind of isolated, you'd say, well, I'm not sure what that means. And a lot of scholars over the years have said, well, I think he's talking about the Eucharist, but a Eucharist host is not something of great size. And given the fact that he was going out there at the time that I suggest, and other historians suggest, that King Abgar of Edessa, Abgar the Great, was converted, and that's when Christianity was established in Edessa. It fits that if the Abgar legend is based upon, in part, the production of an image of Jesus during the conversion of a king named Abgar, it would have been in this period at exactly the time that Aversius, who in his inscription seems to indicate he went to Rome and was designated by the Pope to go on some sort of mission of the Pope, it fits in that if he's saying that he's accompanied by a large fish of great size with its blood mingled with the body, you know, this is what I always say about the medievalists. They say, well, it could be anything, you know, it's a hypothetical or what have you. But what's their explanation of it? Why is this text, and where it fits right in with the history, and during this period of time, the church is enforcing this custom that's called the discipline of the secret, And you are not permitted to make direct references to the pearls of the faith, and certainly a preserved shroud and one that has the image of Jesus would be a pearl of the faith, and you wouldn't make direct reference to it, but you're allowed to reference it symbolically, allegorically, metaphorically, just so that only the Christians know what you're talking about. So that was 2nd century. The 3rd century, just about 20 years later, there's this famous poem. It's called The Hymn of the Pearl. And it's written by a fellow named Bardyson. And he's a philosopher, he's a Christian. And his best childhood friend was King Abgar the Great. And he was a frequenter of the Edessa court. And so if they brought the shroud out there and they used that to convert Abgar and he got baptized, you can bet he invited his best friend and that he would have seen it. And suddenly his reference is in this poem that is written that at the end of the narrative, the protagonist, he calls the King of Kings, which is the reference to Jesus, it's in Revelation. And he said, I'm looking on my robe, it's a cloth, and I see all over it a mirrored image of the King of Kings. And so it's a fairly clear, I think, reference, again, to the fact that Bardyson saw the Turin shroud, because that's the way that you would describe it, at least metaphorically, because with the church enforcing the secrecy code that it has. So now we got 1st century, 2nd century, 3rd century. In the 4th century, one of the famous bishops, saints, is Bishop Athanasius of Alexandria. And he writes a sermon, at least it's attributed to him, in which he says that there was a holy image of our Lord and Savior that was transferred from the Church of Jerusalem to Syria in 68 AD. Now, this is only 30 years after Jesus' death. The Church of Jerusalem is being run up until about 62 by Jesus' brother, and then it's being run basically by other relatives of his. And so what is this holy image of our Lord and Savior when no one has an image of that time? But it just turns out that if it is the shroud, and it's going to Syria, and why should it not go to Syria? That's where the first big Christian settlement was established. It is the city to which St. Peter went and became the first bishop. And so if somebody's got the shroud, it's most likely Peter. He's the head of the apostles, and he goes to Antioch. And I think he uses the shroud at that time. That's why we have this reference in Galatians. But obviously, by the time that Athanasius is writing, the tradition that's come down is that, well, when the shroud went to, when this image of Jesus went to Syria, it was when the Romans came to destroy the Jewish kingdom, and that was at 68 AD. Again, you can ask the medievalists, okay, you don't think that's strong evidence by itself? Then what is this reference? What is this image of Jesus? Who knows about any image of Jesus? Come up with something if it's not the shroud. So we move into the 6th century, and there's a chronicle by Suda Zachariah, and he talks about this image that was being paraded around Anatolia, which is present-day Turkey, at the direction of the Emperor Justinian I. And as the people are seeing it, they are calling it Akira Puwatis. They're saying it's an image which was not made of human hands. Again, if it's not the shroud, what is the image? Well, who's making images not made of human hands? But if you looked at the shroud, one of the first things that you would probably say, we're saying it today, we don't think it's painted, we don't know how it was made, so if you can't give a human explanation for it, then you can ascribe a miraculous explanation for it. So that's 6th century. Then in the 7th century, there's something called the Spanish Mozarabic liturgy. That is, there's a revision to it around the year 600. And who's working on it but Bishop Leandro of Seville? And what was the bishop doing right before he did this revision? He was Spain's ambassador to Constantinople. And by this time, where I think the shroud was by that time was in Constantinople. I think that's why we have these Byzantine Pantocrator images that we have. And I think that the higher church clergy, which he was a high church clergy, and he was also the Spanish ambassador, I think they allowed selected people to view the shroud at that time. And this is what he says. Wasn't in the text before. They changed the Easter liturgy. And it says that Peter and John rushed to the tomb, and now they say for the first time, and there they see the recent imprints of the dead and risen Jesus, which appeared on his burial cloth. Now, I don't know, what are these recent imprints? What would people be saying? How would they describe them in around the year 600? It's a pretty good description. If you're looking at the Turin Shroud, it's got some imprints, and it's the dead and risen Jesus. So somebody is clearly looking at something at that time that they know is a burial cloth. And then you can go to the 8th century, and you have this text by John of Damascus, and it's called the Exposition Fidei. And this is where John writes, out of the blue, that Jesus impressed his image on a hymation. Now, a hymation at that time was an oblong cloth. It was about 2 yards in width, 3 yards in length. And so he's talking about, I don't think he's talking about impressing a face image on a cloth of this size. I think that the information is out at that time that there is a cloth and it has a body image. So that's like the historical background to this, and this jumps me to the 10th century, but it's got this kind of a background to it. And if this text that I'm talking about, the Latin sermon, is a reference to the Turin Shroud, then of course this is a reference that's made almost 300 years before the carbon daters say that the shroud could have been manufactured. So just think about that for a minute and give me the benefit of the doubt for a moment. Let's just say that I'm correct about this. Then look at all this time that we're spending on the science and the disputes that are going back and forth, when at least the issue of whether the shroud is medieval can be resolved by the single text. You might not think that if the shroud existed in the 10th century, it necessarily goes back to the 1st century, but when you combine it with all these references along the way, and then you get to this reference, it's a pretty potentially a big piece of evidence. So that's what I want to focus on, and that's the Latin sermon. Its formal name is Tractatus ex libro Sarorum translatus in Latinum, or the sermon from a Syrian book that was translated into Latin. So in other words, this text was once in a Syrian book, meaning it was written in Syriac text, and then somebody translated it for some reason into Latin. This text has been misunderstood. It's been ignored. It's really ignored, I think, by authenicists, because I don't think they understand it. I think there was something written by Ian Wilson in 1978, and the way that it was written, it was a little bit ambivalent, but I think people thought that he was saying that this sermon could be traced to 769, because there was a sermon given by Pope Stephen III to a Latin synod at that time. And that essentially what happened was that's the same thing that carried through to the 10th century. And, maybe somebody just kind of jazzed it up a little bit. But you have all these authenicists who are saying back in 769, there was a reference to, as you'll see, Jesus' body on cloth in 769. Whereas, I think I might have missed something here. Okay, I'll just do this from here. Whereas, the actual text says, and I've got a slide of it in here somewhere, that when Pope Stephen wrote this sermon, he only referred to a face of Jesus. And if anybody was doing their historical research the way they should do historical research, they should really go back and read this text. I mean, it's in Latin, and you got to find it, and you've got to translate it, and that sort of thing. But you don't get your information from a secondary source, even if it's Ian Wilson, and especially if you're not really understanding what he is saying. But there's just no doubt that this sermon only makes reference to a face of Jesus. Okay. So what I want to do now is to talk about the Abgar legend. And why do I want to do that? Because the Latin sermon is called the Older Latin Abgar legend. So historians believe that the Latin sermon is in this line of stories that's been told about King Abgar. And what's really important to understand, and some people, again, don't know, and the way it's presented to them is not right, they come away thinking the Abgar legend is one unified narrative. It was written at one time, and it's not. It's a story that was written in 5 different formats over the course of 8 centuries. And what it shows is what would be ever-evolving knowledge about the shroud. So in the beginning, they only know so much about the shroud, they put in a legend. Then they find out more about the shroud, and then they change the legend to meet that. Then they find out more, and they change the legend to meet that. And all of this makes perfect sense when you consider where the shroud likely was, and what people would say in terms of changing the legend around. And what's happened with the Abgar legend, there are some people who have just taken the Abgar legend as if it's history on itself, that everything is being said in the Abgar legend actually happened historically. And it's not. I mean, real historians, academic historians, laugh when they hear that. I mean, the very first thing is the Abgar legend says this all happened in Edessa in 33 AD. So by that time you have a Christian conversion of Edessa, and there's not one historical note about a Christian conversion in Edessa right after Jesus' death. And you have St. Luke writing the Acts of the Apostles, and he's talking about the conversions that were done by Paul and others, during the period of the apostles' preaching. And there's not any story whatsoever about the shroud or any kind of a cloth at this time in the original version of the Abgar legend going to Edessa. Okay, I think I'm finally caught up with the slides here. A legend, the Abgar legend. A legend is defined as stories, not always true, that people tell about a famous event or person. The Abgar legend is a series of stories which tells uniformly, everyone says this much, about the conversion of King Abgar V of Edessa, who was a contemporary of Jesus. I've mentioned that they present it as a one unified published narrative, and it's not. And when authenticists invoke the Abgar legend, there's always 4 critical facts about it that they fail to disclose. And I practiced law, and there was 2 kinds of fraud. You could have affirmative fraud, in which I just outright lied to you, and then you can have implied fraud, because there are material facts that you need to know, and I'm withholding them from you. And so if I don't tell you about material facts and you don't have them, you can't make an independent intellectual judgment. And so they don't tell you that historical evidence convincingly establishes that Christianity did not arrive in Edessa until at least the end of the 1st century. So the legend cannot be literally true. Second, they don't tell you that no academic scholar has ever accepted the historicity of the Abgar legend. That's why they call it legend. They don't tell you that many academic scholars, long before I came along, believe that the Abgar legend is actually an allegorical account of the conversion of King Abgar the Great, who we know was converted historically in the late 2nd century. And that is when Christianity was, as a matter of religious facts, that's when Christianity was established in Edessa. And one of the proofs is what we have up here, and this is a coin issued by King Abgar the Great, portraying himself. And you take a look on his tiara there, he's got a cross. And on the other side of this coin, there's a image of Emperor Commodus, who was the most tolerant Roman emperor who did not persecute Christianity between the years 180 and 192. He married a Christian woman, and so he didn't need that kind of headache at home. So, the persecutions went away for a while, and this gave an opportunity for the church, which had the shroud in Antioch at that time, to send a missionary group out to Edessa to formally baptize Abgar the Great. And you can read all the best historians who don't have any skin in the shroud game. The history they're writing is the history about Edessa, Antioch, the Middle East. And they'll tell you that the conversion of Edessa took place around 200, and it came from Antioch. So you have to take that historical fact, and if you do buy into the fact that, as I've said for years, that the shroud at that time is in Antioch, then you could see it going with a missionary, not to be put there permanently and left with a formerly pagan king, but just to be brought out to convince him that he ought to be baptized. But they don't tell you about that. And the fourth thing they don't tell you is that the preeminent historian of Edessa is a gentleman by the name of J.B. Siegel. Very famous, very well respected. He wrote a book in 1970 called Edessa, the Blessed City. And Wilson cited him as the preeminent historian and cites a lot of what it is that he says. But this is what Siegel said about the Abgar legend. He said it is one of the most successful pious frauds of antiquity. So if you know what a pious fraud is, it's not true, but it's something that has been discussed in religious circles, but it's not true literally in terms of what it says. But Siegel, who was also pretty smart and observant, he says every legend is based on a substratum of fact, however distorted or tenuous. So although, excuse me? I can't read that. 5 minutes are left? Time flies when you're having fun. In other words, the task should be of historians, it should be to look through the Abgar legend and to determine what is the substratum of fact of each of the legends. And so, and this is where I'm going to have to go forward now, never going to finish that. The first Abgar legend came from a manuscript that was found in the Royal Archives of Edessa. It was found there by Eusebius and then also by this Syrian writer. And Eusebius was the first to actually put that legend in writing. And the important thing about that is that Eusebius never mentions an image. He never mentions a cloth. He certainly doesn't mention a shroud. He's simply saying that the king was converted because Thaddeus, one of the 70 disciples, went and when he went in to see King Abgar, a marvelous vision appeared on his face. Abgar proclaimed his belief in Jesus, and he was cured of the malady that he had. The substratum of fact in that story is a king of Edessa was once converted to Christianity. That's all that was really known at that time. No cloth, no image, what have you. Might as well stick with these slides. Then in 400, there was called the Doctrine of Addai. That was written by an anonymous Syrian. And here's the substratum of fact of that story. This author mentions that at one point, an image of Jesus is presented to King Abgar. So we're building on what Eusebius said. And now we know that it's King Abgar the Great. And why do we know that it's King Abgar the Great? Because in this version of the story, which had to be in the story that Eusebius saw, but Eusebius did not want to put this in his story. He probably did not want to admit that there was an image of Jesus that existed at that time. But they name a bunch of people who are known to exist during King Abgar the Great's reign, including Zephyrinus, who didn't become pope until 199. The third version of the Abgar legend is the Acts of Thaddeus. A lot of people are aware of this because it's the version that now says that there was a tetradippon, a cloth that has been folded 4 times. The important thing about this is the substratum of fact. There exists, by this time they know, there's not only an image of the face of Jesus, but it's impressed upon a cloth. And we're near the end. It was in this period when this was done that we were getting these pantocrator images of Jesus that, are shroud-like. And there was, I mentioned to you before, a chronicle that said that there was an image out there that was not made of human hands. And then we get to when the image of Edessa is brought from Edessa to Constantinople in 944. And then somebody who's looking this over, maybe the emperor, perhaps this Gregory Referendarius, they notice that there's blood on it. So none of the legends fit that. I mean, Jesus didn't bleed when he was washing his face. So they have to come up with a story now that fits this narrative. And so now it becomes, there's your substratum of fact, and there were bloodstains on the image of Edessa, and therefore the story is now changed that the image was formed when Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he was sweating like blood-like sweat, and so he used this cloth to wipe his face, and that's why you're seeing blood on it. But you see how the legend keeps changing, and nothing about it is historical. It's just being modified. I'm sorry? Oh, okay. I'm just going to go a little bit, because, the truth of the matter is I can't believe it's been 40 minutes, to tell you the truth. I have to get to the subject here, which is that you finally get into the 10th century. By this time, Constantine VII is saying that the relic collection has a sindon that God wore. So we now know that there's a burial cloth in the collection. He does not mention that the burial cloth has an image on it, because Byzantines were still showing Christ as crucified clothed. They were too modest to show him naked. He's not going to admit that there's an image of a naked Christ on here. And this fellow, Robert Drews, who is not an authenticist, these are his words. We may be quite certain that if the emperors had exhibited the entire cloth, it had no explanation for it other than it was Jesus' gift to Abgar, the proprietors of the cloth, that is the emperors, would not only have encountered utter disbelief, but would have so outraged the public that the cloth would have to be destroyed. So this is why nothing was said at that time about the cloth. Now we get to the Latin sermon. And the bottom line here is that this is written only 30 years after Constantine acknowledging that there's a sindon relic. And in this, it has what they call the inscriptio, and you can go through the inscriptio and you will be able to determine who wrote the sermon, because it's written by an archiator, which was a doctor. And there was this doctor who was in Constantinople and served the Byzantine emperors, and then went to the Rus, what was the beginnings of Russia, but it was more like around Kiev, long story short, the emperor's sister, who's beautiful, quite beautiful, the Grand Duke of the Rus agrees to return a Byzantine city that he's captured to the Emperor Basil II if he can have the hand in marriage of his sister, the beautiful Anna. And they make that deal because they want Vladimir to Christianize the Rus. And so in the Inscriptio, it says, number one, the author is an archaeator, and his name is John Smira, and he's a known doctor from that area. He was Polish. That's what the Inscriptio says about that. That's an archaeator. That's Vladimir. And the date of composition, it had to be while he was serving as archaeator. So we know that's between the years 980 and 1015. But we get this direct hint about it. It's about a divinely transformed cloth which is very suitable for this solemnity. What's the solemnity? It's the marriage of Anna to Vladimir. And the story fits perfectly. That's King Basil and his Emperor Basil. That's the beautiful Anna. This is Vladimir getting baptized, and he had this problem where he had lost practically all of his eyesight. He was only 30 years old. But when he got baptized, he came out from the baptismal font, and he had all his eyesight back. So does it remind you of a story? The story is the Abgar legend story. You know, a pagan emperor invites a Christian, in Abgar it's Jesus himself, in this it's Anna, to come to his capital, train him in the faith. And the same ruler, he accepts Jesus, and he's cured of a difficult malady. In the case of Abgar, it was leprosy. In the case of Vladimir, it was blindness. And this is what the Latin sermon says. This is what was translated from the Syrian to the Latin. But if you desire to see my face physically, changing what the legend had been, I will send you a linen on which you will be able to see not only the form of my face, but more readily the divinely transformed state of my body. And Jesus then spread himself and his whole body upon a kind of cloth like snow. So divinely was the form, the domineering face suddenly transferred glorious and the noblest state of the whole body. Okay, I got to wrap this up. The substratum of fact is that there's now a cloth, and it has an image of Jesus on the cloth. And this leads into the very next century where they're doing icons. It's showing a shroud like Jesus raising himself from the dead. That leads into the Hungarian Pray manuscripts illustration. And it's the shroud that precisely fits every piece of historical evidence maintained in the imperial collection. And, you know, this has been out there. I wrote an article about this a couple of years ago. And even the medievalists are not touching this. They're simply saying that, well, if you took the legend literally, Jesus is not dead. But every one of these legends is a legend. This is not an idea of they're trying to write perfectly what the history says. They're trying to convey the fact we now know that there's an image of Jesus' entire body on a cloth. And so if anyone asks you or brings up to you the carbon dating, don't just think of the scientific arguments, think of the historical arguments and say, you explain the Latin sermon to me. If this is not a reference to the Shroud of Turin, then what is it a reference to? Okay.